Okay, so section 4, the time of the world. This is what Sartre also calls universal time. So this is, we've looked at temporality, and that was an investigation into how the for itself, how temporality arises in the world, arising through the for itself. But there's also another aspect to temporality, which is the time of the world, of the in itself, if you like. And that's what we're going to turn our attention to in this section. So the first thing to note is that consciousness of temporality only happens in reflection. In the unreflected mode, the for itself discovers temporality on being, outside itself, and that's this universal time. So when we engage with the world, when we're not in reflection, when we actually engage with the world, when we're immersed in a situation, that is when we discover temporality on the world, on things in the world. And that's what universal time is. That's what this time of the world is. So Sartre says that the thing, this, beings in the world are not temporal. That's an important point. As we already know, being in itself is purely what it is. It's pure being. So there's no way that things in the world can be temporal. They are their own past and future, rather than having to be them, like the for itself. However, the thing appears temporal, and this is because it's revealed through a temporal being, the for itself. But it also appears as atemporal, and in this sense it merely reflects time. So this atemporal temporal appearance manifests as permanence, Sartre says. He also says that things do not endure, rather they are. Time flows over them. And it's kind of a nice description, I think. So the time we're talking about here, befores and afters, which appear on things in the world when we're engaged with those things, they appear as instant in itself. And this is because they appear for itself, which views them through an external relation. So we have these things, right, and they exist over time. So they appear to have this character, this temporal character. But what they are really is, when we perceive them, we see them as being kind of individual, independent in itself, connected in series. And that's what Sartre is talking about when he says befores and afters. The before cup, the now cup, and the after cup. So they're all connected in this way as if they were all independent entities, because the in itself is not temporal. It doesn't endure. So we have these befores and afters that appear as instant in itself, and the way that these in itself appear to transition from before to a present to a future to an after in itself is what Sartre calls abolition and apparition. And he describes this as the way the thing is related to its own nothingness. That is, the time before it existed and the time after it existed. So this is the abolition is the passing away of the thing in itself, and the apparition is the coming to be, when it comes to be. And since abolition and apparition can only appear in a world, and a world can only appear to a for itself, these abolitions and apparitions appear retrospectively and all at once with the upsurge of the for itself. And that leads Sartre to say they are an original structure of perception. So the only way we can perceive things in the world is with this semi-temporal appearance of apparition and abolition coming into and passing away from existence. So that's the way that it's kind of a general overview of universal time. And Sartre also talks about causality here, and he says that causality is not a bond of exteriority between two phenomena. That's how science views causation. But rather it's the way the for itself interprets being in accordance with temporality. So it's a consequence of the for itself perceiving the in itself. It arises, what we've just seen, befores and afters, the abolition and apparitions, they all appear simultaneously through the for itself. And so there is no real prior cause determining a future effect. Rather, all of this is being generated and coming into being through this original perception of the for itself. And so Sartre continues, as soon as this perception occurs, causality disintegrates into a relation of exteriority. And that relation of exteriority exists between the things prior to the appeared and the appeared itself. And that's what that's where the scientific notion of causality comes from. Once the for itself has apprehended the in itself in this way, then that causality, with that original interpretation that the for itself brings to the things in the world, disintegrates, and we're left with a relation of pure exteriority between the this prior to now and the this as it exists now. And that's what gives us the impression that causality is the prior causes acting on in such a way that present effects necessarily follow. So he looks at the past, the present, and the future. I'll just take each one of these individually. So the past is the refers to the situation where the thing, appears as having been already there. But since it does not appear as a past that it has to be, it stands isolated from the present. And that's all tied in with everything we just talked about with the the instant in itself, the befores and afters and the abolitions and the apparitions. That's all connected with this way that the past in itself appear to stand isolated from present in itself. So with the present, this appears again through the for itself as presence to being, which means that it is not. We've already seen that. But the this which appears to that presence is the thing which appears to that presence is. So we have this, again, another dichotomy. The presence to being is not, we've already encountered that, and yet there is this thing which is. And that's, it's not a problem, it's just the way that this whole thing works out. And this is why the universal present appears as not being at the moment, but also as being the unique measure of being. And I think what Sartre is getting at there is that when we think about the present, it seems not to have any, it seems not to exist. It's the limit point between the past and the future. But it also seems to be where everything happens, the unique measure of being. It's the only time dimension that we live in. It's the only dimension we live in. So it has this odd dual apprehension. And the reason it has that is because of this, is because it is presence to being, which means it's not, but it's also associated with a thing in the world that is. So these two contradictory elements feature when we try and think about the present. So being is revealed in the present as being in motion. And if it wasn't for motion, if there was no motion, the present dimension of universal time would be inapprehensible. And that means that the for itself could never apprehend itself as presence to being. So there are some Eleatic paradoxes of motion which Sartre wants to investigate here. And so what these paradoxes, they came from a school of pre-Socratic philosophers headed by a guy called Parmenides, and he thought that being was all there is. They're pretty much the opposite of Sartre, actually. He thought the only thing that exists is being. Non-being is completely impossible. We can't even think about it, we can't talk about it. It's the only thing that exists is being. And that means that any kind of impermanence or change that we see around us must be an illusion. Because the only thing that exists is what is. What is. And one of his students, Zeno, came up with some paradoxes to demonstrate that change is an illusion. And one of these paradoxes involves an arrow, and it's designed to show that the movement is impossible, because movement is basically a change of location. So he wants to show that this specific instance of change, location, is impossible. And so he did this by saying that imagine you have an arrow and it's flying towards its target. Well, at each point, the arrow can be considered to be at rest. at each point in time, the arrow is not moving. It's stationary where it is. And the flight path of the arrow is composed of nothing but these individual moments of time, moments in which the arrow is stationary. So the conclusion is that the arrow never actually moves through space. It doesn't change its position. It's always at rest where it is. It's just at rest. It's always at rest at each moment. That's the key point here. So that was Zenos Paradox of Motion. And Sartre says this paradox appears because we treat motion as just a pure change of place, affecting a this which remains unaltered. So if we decide to treat motion as just a change of place, change of location, and the thing moving, the thing that's changing place remains unaltered, then we end up with this paradox, which is that something which is permanently at rest, at every moment it's at rest, seems to be moving. And he says the solution is that being in motion is not the same as being in itself. So location, we've already seen as spatiality, is a relation of exteriority. It's a relation of the this to the ground, to the background, to the totality. And when a thing is in motion, the thing, loses this relation. It's removed from its being. The thing is removed from its being in itself. And Sartre calls this state being exterior to itself. So motion is a being which is not being in motion, but which doesn't become nothingness, because it is being in itself. So what relation does the for itself perceive in a thing in motion? Exteriority to self. It's an external relation, and an external relation to itself. And this external relation is a nothing. And Sartre calls that nothing the trajectory, if that makes sense. So I'm going to leave it there. I'm not going to dwell anymore on that, for risk of confusing myself, really. The future, talking about the future, every future state of the world remains strange to the for itself because it's apprehended in an exteriority of indifference. So it's again apprehended as an external relation, external negation. And that means that each future state of the world appears as a probable, not a possible. Remember, the possible is our own future, the future of the for itself. So these probables are the future states of the world, and they appear through an external negation. So these probables they're not probabilized in the same way that possibles are possibilized. They're not probabilized. They are as probables, as now in itself, just in the future, now in itself to come. So there's no true temporality assigned to them, or they're not. They don't manifest any true temporality. They appear just as future in itself, future moments. So universal time, then, this whole discussion of universal time is a nothingness in itself. and it appears in another nice phrase as the shimmer of nothingness on the surface of a strictly atemporal being. And it only appears when we are being our possibilities, when we're engaged in the world, when we non-reflectively engage with, when we're non-reflectively engaged in a situation. And that's objective time. Hopefully that makes some kind of sense. It's basically just a way of understanding temporality, time. It's kind of the origin. It's not the original. It's the way that we automatically or normally think of time. We think of time as being in the world, and we think of objects as existing in time. But we've seen with the couple of videos back, original temporality is it's nothing to do with an external force carrying us along through time, moving from the past to the present to the future. It's an internal feature. It's a characteristic of being for itself. And this normal apprehension that we have of time, this everyday understanding we have of time, is what Sartre calls universal time, or the time of the world. And that's time as it appears for us when we think about things existing. And that's where we get these individual moments of time in itself. And that's where I'm going to stop that section. And just quickly to finish up, have a look at section 5, the last section here, entitled Knowledge. So basically Sartre looks at, he just mentions two things here. One is in relation to idealism. So he concedes that yes, knowledge, which we've been looking at this whole chapter, knowledge is subjective. The being of the for itself is knowledge of being. But, however, knowledge is not the measure of being. So knowledge is just the presence of being to the for itself. And the for itself is only the nothing which realizes this presence. So in that sense, idealism is partly correct when it says that the for itself, or consciousness, creates being in itself, creates things. It's partly correct, but qualified in that way that I just mentioned, is not the measure of being. And to with regards to realism, again he says yes, being is present to consciousness and knowledge, but, however, being cannot be independent of consciousness and apprehended via an internal representation in the mind and within consciousness. Being is only able to be realized through the negation of being, which consciousness is. So again, there's a partial concession to realism. Yes, it is. Being is present to consciousness. When we know something, there is a being present before us, but it's not independent of us. It's connected to us in that way through that negation that we spent so long looking at in this chapter. And that is where I'm going to wrap up, and we'll continue next video looking at the next section. Thank you.